Katie Halper.
You're Katie Halper. I'm
Yes.
Matt. Good Monday morning, everybody.
And
And we have a special stream today because right after we do Monday morning, when we finish at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be joined on a different stream by Norman Finkelstein to do an update on the Gaza war. If you have any questions for Norman, you can put them in the chat and we will try to ask him. And there's so much to discuss with him because the media is doing such a terrible job covering the war. So we thought we'd bring Norman in just to do a special update on how things are going in this awful Israeli assault on Gaza.
yes, and the link to that is in the description. So all you have to do right after this is click on that link, or click on it now and open it up in another tab. Whatever. So you're ready.
So that link is right there in the show description, and we'll start right after we finish Monday morning. So should we get to it?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Let's go to our weekly recap from Meet the Press.
Good Sunday morning. The U.S. is stepping up its military readiness across the Mideast, citing escalations by Iran and its proxy forces as the U.S. and Israel prepare for a widening war. American-Israeli hostages Judith and Natalie Raanan spoke to President Biden on Saturday after being released by Hamas. They were abducted in the terror attack 2 weeks ago in southern Israel.
Hey, Judith.
Hello, President.
I'm so glad you're home. Or not home, I'm glad you're out.
Thank you so very, very much.
Hey, Nat, how are you? God love you.
I just want to say thank you for your services for Israel.
Now, according to the Israel...
That's weird. That's interesting. Want to thank you for your services for Israel.
Well, he's providing a lot of services. He's arming Israel as it's bombarding indiscriminately a civilian population in Gaza. He's blocking UN resolutions trying to call for a ceasefire. He's repeating Israeli state propaganda, like, for example, when he said that he'd seen pictures of 40 beheaded babies. That was a lie. So he's providing a lot of services.
Yeah, sure. I was just surprised that she actually mentioned that. But, yeah, good on that person, Nat, for pointing that out. Also, just wanted to say, you know, a lot of people, if you may find yourself discussing what's happening right now in Gaza, some people will say, well, what's Israel supposed to do? Not defend itself? What's Israel supposed to do? They use human shields, which, as Norman has explained on my show and can talk about it again today, there's actually much more evidence for Israel using human shields. But what are they supposed to do? Negotiate with Hamas? You can't negotiate with Hamas. Well, two released hostages later, we see you can actually negotiate with Hamas.
Yeah. And what are you not allowed to do? You're not allowed to bombard civilians indiscriminately, even if something horrible happens to you. You don't have the right to go and just destroy civilian buildings and attack hospitals and mosques and schools and, you know, kill generations of Palestinians. The death toll now, I believe, is over 4,000. Last time I checked in Gaza, it rises every day. You have no international right to do that. People have the right to defend themselves, but also you don't have the right to occupy an entire population, and they have the right to fight back. And so if you don't want horrible things to happen, you have to end your occupation. It's just pretty simple.
Right.
That's the formula.
But people who ask that question will not be satisfied with that answer, of course.
Yeah, well...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, yeah. And this is part of the I think, like, reasons that the over-vilification... I mean, people are going to clip this and get me in trouble, whatever. But, you know, Hamas... It's almost like some people would rather Israel, through Qatar or however, Qatar, not negotiate, because they'd rather not have any freed hostages, because it's not about saving people's lives, it's about killing Palestinians.
Absolutely. And this just got actually, I mean, this has been openly acknowledged. There's an Israeli cabinet minister who said that our top priority is destroying Hamas, not the hostages.
Not freeing the hostages.
Not freeing the hostages.
Yeah.
And here, listen, this is from, I will show you this. This is from the Washington Post just the other day. This is what it says. One U.S. official said it was clear that Netanyahu was not going to wait until the hostage crisis was resolved to initiate a ground offensive, and there was little Washington could do to change that calculus. The Israeli leader has continuously bucked U.S. demands during the Biden era, and officials are loath to create a public spat as Republicans on Capitol Hill search for any sign of the president being insufficiently pro Israel.
So disgusting.
There's two really telling statements there. First of all, this U.S. official says there's nothing, or there's little Washington could do to change Netanyahu's decision to carpet bomb Gaza and invade rather than negotiate. Well, actually, the U.S. role here is instrumental. Israel couldn't do what it's doing without the U.S. The U.S. provides critical weaponry and also diplomatic cover for Israel by blocking UN resolutions, for example. So the U.S. has huge leverage over Israel. Every time the U.S. really actually does step up and tell Israel to do something, generally it does comply. And in fact, the Israeli defense minister just admitted that. He said that they didn't want to provide any humanitarian aid to Gaza, but they backed off after the U.S. demanded it. And the Israeli defense minister said, well, what else are we supposed to do? We need them for weapons. So even Israel's defense minister admits that U.S. has critical leverage. So it's a decision by Biden not to try to use it. And then, of course, the real tell is that Biden is scared here of being seen as insufficiently pro-Israel.
Right.
So that's really what the problem is here. Is Biden doesn't want to do anything that makes him seem insufficiently pro-Israel. So he doesn't want to be insufficiently pro-mass murder, insufficiently pro-genocide. That's
he wants to make sure the blood on his hands is really flowing.
Yeah. Okay, back to Kirsten Walker.
Israeli military, 212 hostages are still being held captive, at least 30 of them under the age of 16. The first 20 trucks carrying aid moved through the Rafah border crossing from Egypt into Gaza on Saturday. But
by the way, see if you find the way she says under 16 and her empathy for those young people who my heart goes out to them. I want to be clear about that. But let's see if she has any of that kind of empathy for the Palestinians who are being killed.
Including thousands of children.
Yeah.
The last time I checked on the child death toll, it was over 1,700. Probably way more than that now. I'm probably giving an old figure.
Someone in the comments, and this is just comments, so we'll have to verify it. 5,000 total, 2,000 children.
That's correct, yeah. According to Defense for Children in Palestine, at least 2,055 Palestinian children in Gaza. And more than 830 children are reported missing under the rubble. As we're recording this, it's hard to fathom, but Israel just launched its most deadly barrage of airstrikes to date, just in the last 24 hours. It's hard to contemplate that because it's been so ferocious, but that's what's happening as we're speaking.
did not include fuel critical to keeping hospitals running and to providing clean water. And there's the threat of a widening war. President Biden and
we might have missed that, but basically she's saying that this humanitarian aid convoy that just got into Gaza for the first time after days and days and days, finally 20 trucks, which is of course less than a drop in the bucket, was allowed in. But she's saying there it did not include fuel. And the reason it didn't include fuel is because Israel refused to allow fuel in. Because Israel says that can help Hamas with their military activity. So the fuel that Gaza runs on, it powers everything, hospitals, bakeries, everything, not included in this so-called humanitarian convoy of 20 trucks.
Also, Israel is the Israeli government is the same government that doesn't allow things like cinnamon and chocolate to get through the blockade. So
that's correct. That is correct. Yes.
It's not always about what sometimes it's just very vindictive. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry. Yeah.
Now, well, no, they calculated the calories
right.
that Gazans would need to basically barely survive.
Right.
The term by one Israeli minister was putting Gaza on a diet.
Yeah. So they're technically food insecure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Top aides have been urging Israeli leaders against carrying out any major strike against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which could draw Israel into a two-front war. And there's the growing threat from Iran. On Wednesday, at least 2 drones targeted a U.S. garrison in southern Syria, injuring several U.S. personnel. Drones and rockets also targeted bases with U.S. troops in Iraq this week, resulting in several more minor injuries. Thursday, a U.S. Navy ship in the northern Red Sea downed 4 cruise missiles and more than a dozen drones launched from Yemen by pro-Iranian Houthi forces that seem to be heading towards Israel. Overnight, the Pentagon announced the U.S. is sending additional missile defense systems to the region, moving a carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf, and putting additional U.S. troops on prepare to deploy orders. President Biden is linking a request for aid to Israel to Ukraine, formally asking Congress for $105 billion in emergency funding. On Thursday night, the president pressed for American engagement at a time of growing global instability.
History has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. They keep going, and the cost and the threats to America and the world keep rising.
That sounds like a good description of what happens with the Israeli government and the U.S. government.
It's like we have George W. Bush back in the White House, but even more demented and with even less congressional pushback.
Right. And of course, less opposition from the left, the left, because
Absolutely.
we don't have a Republican in office.
Yeah, exactly. And again, notice how, like, the way it's framed there, like it's the threat from Iran that is
Right.
growing because apparently some U.S. forces were targeted by an Iran-backed group in Syria. Well, again, why are U.S. troops in Syria? Why are they there? And how does that contribute to regional peace when you have U.S. troops occupying 1/3 of Syria, stealing its oil and its wheat? And at times like this, when you have the U.S. encouraging this massacre in Gaza, that's going to increase the danger for everyone, including U.S. troops that are engaged in these illegal occupations elsewhere, including in Syria. In Iraq, they're there because there was that time when the Iraqi parliament voted for U.S. troops to withdraw, and the U.S. responded by basically threatening to freeze
Right.
Iraq's foreign reserves. So that took care of that. So we have U.S. troops in Iraq still. We have U.S. troops in Syria. No one knows why, except for the time when Trump admitted that we were there to steal
Oil.
Syria's oil. And then in Yemen, of course, we have, she referred to the pro-Iranian Houthi rebels. That's an indigenous local force that exists basically because they're responding to a Saudi invasion that
Right.
happened with the
With our
backing
help.
of the U.S.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's all these multiple crises that the U.S. has created are now coalescing into one, but it's framed as the threat is coming from somebody else.
Right.
It's coming from Iran and its allies.
But Aaron, as Biden himself just said, when terrorists don't pay a price, there's no stopping them. And I think if you apply that to what the U.S. and Israel are doing, then that's true. State-sanctioned terrorism.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
Okay.
we have a real banger of a clip coming up. We got Anthony Blinken talking to Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation. Let's see what he has to say.
What has happened, turning the page to what has happened during the following 2 weeks. UNICEF says 1,524 children have been killed in the Gaza Strip during these bombings. Why isn't the U.S. calling for at least a temporary ceasefire?
By the way, this is a low bar, but good on Margaret Brennan for actually asking that question.
First, Margaret, when I hear the stories, when I see the pictures of young children who have lost their lives in this conflict of Hamas is making, whoever they are.
Okay, so immediately links it back to Hamas, right? It's almost as if Israel's illegal, indiscriminate bombing, war crimes aren't happening. This is all Hamas, okay? He wants to remind you.
Wherever they are, whether they're Palestinians, whether they're Israelis, whether they're Jews or Muslims. It hits me, and I know it hits virtually everyone, right in the heart. And that's why it's so important to do everything possible to protect them, and why it's so...
You know, everything possible includes, of course, calling for a ceasefire.
Which was the question, which he's not answering.
Right.
And he's such a terrible actor. He's trying to act empathetic, and you can just see in his eyes. I mean, I don't see a soul there. I'm sorry to do body language reading, but he's such a cold, soulless person.
Yeah.
He has no passion, and everything is so phony.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what you have to do when you're justifying continuing to murder children.
Yeah. You either have to be a sociopath or you have to turn yourself into one.
Yeah.
So important to do everything possible to get assistance to those who need it.
So
Food,
why not
medicine,
ask for
water.
at least a temporary pause in the bombing, as was proposed at the UN this week?
We've seen, first of all, that in order to get assistance in, we've had that happen, and you saw the first 20 trucks go in yesterday. I expect more will follow.
That wasn't the question.
Yeah.
She's not asking about these meager 20 trucks that don't even include fuel because Israel won't allow them. She's asking about why not push for at least a temporary ceasefire.
Follow today, and the day after that, we want to make sure that we have sustained delivery of food, medicine, water, the things that people need. At the same time, I said something a minute ago that we have to remember. Israel has to do everything it can to make sure this doesn't happen again. Freezing things.
Which is why you have to just kill thousands of children.
In place where they are now would allow Hamas to remain where it is and to repeat what it's done sometime in the future. No country could accept that.
I mean, the logic also applies to Hamas. Like, Hamas could say, well, we have to do everything we possibly can do to prevent Israel from terrorizing us, which Israel's done constantly for decades and decades and decades. And, this will offend some people, but Hamas has a much stronger argument because they're the ones being occupied. And Israel's rejected all efforts to end the occupation. It's refused to give up its control of Gaza. It's refused to give up its settlements in the West Bank. So if you're going to make the argument that Blinken's doing here, that states have the right to commit mass terror, to kill civilians, then logic applies equally to Palestinians who have a much stronger argument because they're the ones being occupied.
Right.
And they're the ones who actually tried to, including Hamas, have before accepted the internationally accepted two-state solution, although Hamas did it in a tacit way, but still it was better.
But Jimmy Carter, who's a pretty reliable source, basically said that they were willing to do that.
Jimmy Carter said that too. So if you're going to try to justify mass terror, then that logic has to apply both ways. And what he's basically, but of course it doesn't in his eyes. It only applies to the U.S. and its allies, who, as he says there, basically what he's saying is that we have the right to kill as many children as we want. And of course, even tactically, the idea that this could prevent Hamas. How does killing a bunch of children prevent Hamas from launching another attack like that ever again? It's not even.
Or create more people who want to do that. Like, this is a great PR, seeing all these innocent kids killed. What's going to make people willing to do stuff like that more than that?
Yeah.
It's really disgusting. And the whole way that they're treating Palestinians as collateral damage, Palestinian civilians, and basically holding them responsible for the actions of Hamas is just so rich, given that Israel is so much more of a militarized society because of their conscription. Like, everyone serves. So by that standard, Israelis are actually much more culpable than Palestinians. Do they really want to be setting up this precedent? Is that really their moral framing?
Yeah. And again, you're not endorsing that.
No. I'm not endorsing it.
That's their logic, exactly.
I'm saying if you're going to look at that logic and you're saying that these people are responsible because of what Hamas does, how does that not translate then into, well, the Israelis are responsible for what their government does? They elected
100%.
their government.
100%.
And I don't want anyone to die. That's why something like a ceasefire would be great, not just for Palestinians, but for Israeli Jews. But again, we talked about this on our last episode with Miko Peled. The bloodlust and vengeance is much stronger than the desire to save lives for much of Israeli society. And if you missed that episode, there's this really scary part where you see a father of a hostage. His daughter is a hostage, and he's protesting, and people attack him and say that he should be lynched because they see him as a traitor, because he's daring to call for Israel to do something to get his daughter released.
Yeah. Okay, well, unfortunately, everybody, we have a lot more Blinken
Sorry, yeah.
to get through.
Of course, as we reported, of course, those 2 American hostages have been released this morning. Hamas has come out with a statement saying they are prepared to release 2 more hostages. What can you tell us about that? Do you see this as a credible offer coming from this terrorist organization?
Well, first, Kristen, we've been working on this from day one, engaged with different partners in the region, sending clear messages about the need to immediately and unconditionally release all of the hostages. And it was gratifying to see that Judith and Natalie Ronan were released yesterday. I had a chance to speak to them as well. They sounded strong of mind, strong of spirit, but there remain many others, and we're hopeful that more released. But the bottom line is this: they need to be released, each and every one of them, now, unconditionally.
Do you take this word by Hamas that they are potentially prepared to release 2 more hostages seriously? Is the U.S. government, for example, working with Qatar to make that happen as we speak?
Well, acts are what speak, not words, particularly coming from Hamas.
Who just freed 2 hostages.
Yeah, which sounds like an act.
That sounds like an act, yeah, perhaps.
But we've been engaged, as I said, with partners. So one of the first things that I did after the horrific attack of October 7th and hostages were taken, men, women, young children, elderly people, it's extraordinary, was to talk to everyone we could who might have influence with Hamas in terms of releasing them. In the instance of Judith and Natalie, I again want to thank the government of Qatar for playing a very important role in getting them out and now on their way home to see their loved ones.
Let me show you this. This is Israel's official position. So Hamas just offered to release 2 more hostages. And what was the Israeli Prime Minister's office response? This is from Al Jazeera. Israel's Prime Minister office has confirmed that Israel has declined to accept 2 Israeli hostages from Hamas, stating they will not address what is considered to be mendacious propaganda by the group.
That sounds like a government that wants to do everything to protect its citizens.
Yes. So we won't accept your offer to release more hostages because somehow that's mendacious propaganda.
Yeah, because it goes against their framing of these people as literal Nazis, which is what they're doing. They're calling them Nazis. When Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, was asked about Palestinian civilians, he was like, "Are you really asking me about them? We're fighting Nazis."
So Blinken says, actions speak louder than words. Hamas releases 2 American hostages, then they offer to free 2 Israeli hostages. And Israel says that act of offering to free those, that's mendacious propaganda.
Right. Actions speak louder than words. I mean, actions are mendacious propaganda.
Yes. Okay, more Blinken.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
And of course, those 2 American hostages have been released this morning. Hamas has come out with a statement saying they are prepared to release 2 more hostages. What can you tell us about that? Do you see this as a credible offer coming from this terrorist organization?
Didn't we just play this one?
Been a lot of discussion. Mr. Secretary, there's been a lot of discussion about what happens after the war. Can you tell us what Israel's strategy is after your meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Who will govern Gaza once the war is over?
One thing's for sure: Israel cannot go back to the status quo. And again, no country would be able to accept that.
But is there a
No
clear
country would
strategy,
want to go
Mr.
back.
Secretary? Is it clear who's going to govern Gaza once this war is over?
I think we know 2 things.
He says, Israel can't go back to the status quo. He's saying that from Israel's perspective. But what about from Palestinians' perspective? The status quo is brutal occupation, where Israel controls the entire Gaza Strip, subjects it to a blockade, puts over 2 million people in a concentration camp, an open-air prison. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, Israel expands its settlements. These fanatical settlers from places like Brooklyn and elsewhere terrorize Palestinians, steal their land, steal their water. Notice how that status quo for Palestinians was tenable. That Blinken was never saying that status quo was untenable. Now it's only Israel that can't go back to the status quo where they face a military threat from Hamas. That's the only status quo that he's concerned about, not about this decades-long brutal military occupation, which again is never even discussed on these shows. We haven't heard the word occupation so far, unless I missed it.
No, of course not. And of course, this is because this is what is motivating Israel and the United States is not peace in this area.
Yeah.
They don't want to bring this to a resolution. They want to ethnically cleanse Gaza.
Let's move on to the next clip.
And by the way, this is also a danger of the over-vilification of Hamas. And I'm not a Hamas fan, but turning them into this caricature of evil means there isn't the necessary pressure that should be on Israel and the United States to negotiate with them. So that's part of why they have to be turned into this cartoon villain.
In attacks against U.S. or you have seen an uptick in attacks against U.S. military facilities, against troops around the region. Overnight, the Pentagon announced it was actually increasing its force posture in the region. How concerned are you about Iran trying to escalate this war?
We are concerned. In fact, we expect that there's a likelihood of escalation by Iranian proxies directed against our forces, directed against our personnel. We are taking steps to make sure that we can effectively defend our people and respond decisively if we need to. This is not what we want, not what we're looking for. We don't want.
So we're occupying multiple countries. There are U.S. forces inside Syria, U.S. forces inside Iraq. Israel is basically a U.S. military outpost. And it's the other countries that are somehow escalating the situation. One great way to de-escalate would be, for example, to withdraw U.S. troops from all these regions where they're targets for people who want to avenge the U.S. for its support of Israel and massacre in Gaza. And again, the continued bombardment of the civilian population, according to the questioner here, is not escalation. So intensified airstrikes that destroy civilian areas, kill people by the thousands in Gaza, that's not an escalation. It's the potential Hamas allies elsewhere, them responding, that is considered escalation by our media and Blinken. And the possibility of trying to engage in negotiations, a ceasefire, that's not considered a tactic of de-escalation.
Right.
And by the way, it was just reported in the New York Times that Netanyahu really wanted to launch a preemptive strike against Hezbollah in Lebanon right after October 7th to basically send a message to Hezbollah. And that's an example of escalation. And Israel didn't do that, but the fact that that was even discussed shows that Israel's not in this to be defensive. They've been attacking not just the Gaza Strip and the West Bank for a long time, but also Lebanon, which they invaded in 1982 and then occupied for many years before they were chased out by Hezbollah, and then bombarded Lebanon in the summer of 2006. If you remember, that's when Condoleezza Rice said, these are the birth pangs of the new Middle East. So there's a long history of Israeli escalation, and if Blinken cared about trying to, prevent an escalation, he would be addressing that, not encouraging it.
Right, of course.
Okay, well, we have another.
And guys, by the way, I know I do this in a joking, threatening way, but please do like this stream because we want as many people to come to this as possible, and this helps the algorithm. So if you haven't already liked it, just give a thumbs up. It's a really easy way to get the show out so other people see it, because we do think this is important for people to see. Because it's slightly different from what most analysis offers.
All right, let's go to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
Oh, yeah.
Defense Lloyd. Joining us now is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Secretary Austin, thank you for being here. I want to start with those moves you announced late yesterday, last night. You've got the USS Eisenhower going to the Persian Gulf. You've got more missile defense systems headed to the region. Troops put on standby. What's behind these moves?
Well, Jonathan, as you know,
Sounds like he's talking about dancing, these moves.
recently we've seen rocket and UAV attacks against bases housing our troops in Iraq and Syria. We're concerned about potential escalation. In fact, what we're seeing is the prospect of a significant escalation of attacks on our troops and our people throughout the region. And because of that, we're going to do what's necessary to make sure that our troops are in the right, good position, they're protected, and that we have the ability to respond. Now, this additional deployment sends another message to those who would seek to widen this conflict. As President Biden said earlier, and as you've heard me say, if any group or any country is looking to widen this conflict and take advantage of this very unfortunate situation that we see, our advice is don't. We maintain the right to defend ourselves, and we won't hesitate to take the appropriate action.
Generally, the right to defend oneself is granted to states who are attacked from the outside, inside their own borders, not to occupying military armies that are in countries like in Syria against the will of the local government. Like, the U.S. was not invited by Syria into Syria. Syria doesn't want the U.S. there. And by keeping U.S. forces there, they're constantly putting U.S. troops at risk. And because it's never discussed that we're in Syria, most people don't even know that we're there, but if that ever were acknowledged, as it is occasionally like now, people ask, like, why are we there? Well, again, according to the people who deployed the troops there, Donald Trump, we're there to take Syria's oil. There's someone in the Biden administration named Dana Stroul who said the same thing, that we're there to basically obtain leverage over Syria and help affect the political outcome in Syria, which means regime change, by stealing Syria's oil and its wheat. She explained all this a lot more than Trump did. That basically that allows us to shape Syria's future. So basically, is it worth endangering U.S. troops and increasing the threat of escalation just to keep the U.S. in Syria to be able to steal its oil? And that could be one way to reduce the threat of escalation. But again, it's not an option to these people.
Right. It obviously is worth it, Aaron, for them.
The only option is more escalation, so more troops.
Right.
Another U.S. naval ship, that's the only tactic that these people can see is just more and more escalation. Okay, more from Lloyd Austin.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, one of the Israeli military spokesmen, told ABC this week that if Hamas places a rocket in the courtyards of schools, we're going to strike that. What's your sense? And these are obviously incredibly difficult decisions, but is a school a legitimate target if Hamas is using it effectively for cover? How would you handle that? You dealt with things like this in Mosul.
Certainly, you have to evaluate the target, the value of the target, who's at that location. And
So note he won't say that a school is not a legitimate target, right? That was the question. And he's not saying, of course, a school is not a legitimate target.
we always have, we always get legal advice from our lawyers who are with us on the battlefield. But to your point, each target, John, needs to be assessed, carefully assessed, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that civilians are not injured or threatened. So the right thing to do is to make sure that we account for civilians in our planning, that we provide corridors for their movement out of the battle space, that we are not destroying protected properties and where possible. And I think the Israelis have been doing this for some time. Again, they are a professional force, and we will continue to encourage them to make sure that they're doing things in accordance with the law of war.
Notice how he can't even say that Israel actually is taking steps to protect civilian life.
Right.
All he says is, Israel's been doing this for a long time.
Exactly.
They do the game for a while.
They know how to bomb hospitals and schools. Yeah. They're good
He
at
doesn't
this.
say they're actually doing that because they're not. He knows they're not. He knows they're bombing hospitals.
Right.
He knows they've just bombed a Christian church inside Gaza. He knows they're bombing schools, all these civilian targets. So he can't bring himself, to his credit, I guess, to lie through his teeth. He has to just avoid giving a direct answer.
We have a criticism in the form of a super chat, but I feel like it may be worth responding to. Do I have permission, Aaron?
Sure, yeah.
All right. The irony of two Jews chastising other Jews for apartheid and occupation while they participate in apartheid and occupation for Native American lands. So I'm sure that Space 99 Yak dedicates his life to advocacy for Native Americans, right?
Yeah, well, the problem is there's not an ongoing military occupation of Native American lands where they're confined to an open-air prison like in Gaza, and where, American settlers are, moving into homes, stealing their lands, attacking them with weaponry,
Right.
And all this is being done with, the full support of the U.S.
Right. And bombs.
Yeah, yeah. It's true that both countries are founded on ethnic cleansing. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
But the problem is the ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza and the West Bank is ongoing.
Yeah.
And it's massive.
Right.
And it's done with critical U.S. support.
Right.
So, yes.
So
unfortunately, there's not,
close with that analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway.
This were a couple hundred years ago. Yeah. Okay. Next clip.
It is all interconnected.
And you've said that you believe there is enough oversight of aid to Ukraine. Why hasn't that persuaded some members of the Republican caucus?
If you look at the Ukraine assistance, let's talk about where the money's really going. A significant portion of it's being spent in the United States, in 38 different states, replacing the weapons that we sent to Ukraine with more modern weapons. So we're rebuilding our industrial base.
That's what President Biden's seeking to do.
It's correct. No Americans are getting killed in Ukraine. We're rebuilding our industrial base. The Ukrainians are destroying the army of one of our biggest rivals. I have a hard time finding anything wrong with that. I think it's wonderful that they're defending themselves. And also the notion that the Europeans are not doing enough. They've done almost $90 billion. They're housing a bunch of refugees who escaped. I think that our NATO allies in Europe have done quite a lot.
Well, thank you. This is Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate. And thank you for a reminder that there's a proxy war going on in Ukraine, because it's sort of faded from the headlines. But of course, Biden, in his latest spending package, where he's asking Congress for more than $100 billion, more than $60 billion from that is for the Ukraine proxy war, because Biden needs to extend that war until at least the November 2024 election, because he doesn't want to face a humiliating defeat there. And Mitch McConnell, because we live under a uniparty where, support for wars are bipartisan, right. Mitch McConnell is extolling the virtues of that war with, again, his signature argument that we're now using Ukraine to rebuild our industrial base in the U.S. So somehow now this war in Ukraine which Biden says is about defending democracy against autocracy. Really, according to Mitch McConnell, it's about rebuilding our defense industrial base as if it needed rebuilding on top of the trillions of dollars that already spent on it. And also, it's also using Ukraine to kill Russian forces, as he also says is happening. So he says, I can't see the problem with that. And if you're a neocon in Washington, yeah, what's the problem? All the money is going to the military-industrial complex. Russians are being killed. What's the problem?
Yeah, great.
That's a more candid articulation of the reasons for this proxy war than anything Biden has said so far. Although Biden is now adopting McConnell's line. So this week in his Oval Office address, Biden, for the first time, I believe, said that these weapons we're sending, they're the arsenal of democracy. And he mentioned the swing states of Pennsylvania and Ohio where some of these weapons are made. So everybody wins.
Everybody wins. It's a win-win. Yeah.
Yeah. So great stuff from Mitch. And here's more from Mitch McConnell, who is going to, just continuing with this theme of like we're living under a new Bush administration.
Right.
Here's a reminder of that from Mitch McConnell.
President Biden said he's going to hold Iran accountable. What do you think that means?
I think the proof will be what are we going to do to hold them accountable, and it's got to be credible. You can't on the one hand be negotiating with Iran on some kind of nuclear deal that you know they won't keep, and then turn around and declare that you're going to get tougher with Iran. I think number one, quit talking to the Iranians about any kind of nuclear deal. Number two, don't give them the $6 billion. And number three, back up the Israelis in every conceivable way after this attack by Iran-sponsored Hamas.
Well, so one of his proposals there is don't give Iran $6 billion.
Right.
But that suggests the U.S. is giving Iran $6 billion. All that was happening was the U.S. was going to stop stealing Iran $6 billion. But Biden has done exactly what Mitch McConnell asked for there. They have frozen that agreement in which Iran was going to be allowed to re-access its own money that the U.S. had stolen. That was frozen after October 2nd. So, request granted by Biden to Mitch McConnell and showing how
Bipartisan. Yeah.
But he has more here. Mitch McConnell is going to say something very profound. So let's hear it.
You oppose all diplomacy with Iran.
It's not a question of whether you ever talk to them or not, but it's a question of what do you do? What do you do? And clearly, the nuclear deal that the Obama administration agreed to and the Biden administration tried to connect is not the way to go. There's an axis of evil in the world: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And we need to stand up to the axis of evil, not try to do business with them.
I've never heard that before, that there being an axis of evil,
No.
bad guy states. That's a new one.
Yeah.
Yes. How original.
How original. Nice throwback.
Yeah. Well, for those, I'm kidding. For those who don't remember, during the Bush administration, he had his own axis of evil.
Right.
It was
Iran,
I think North
Korea. And Cuba? Yeah. Wasn't Cuba on that?
No, it was just 3 countries.
Okay.
So now we have an updated axis of evil for Mitch McConnell. So great. Welcome to Bush administration
2.0. Yeah.
They just swapped out North Korea. They put in China, and they also swapped out Iraq and put in Russia. So, they kept in North Korea. So now, according to McConnell, it's China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Before it was just Iran, Iraq, and North Korea.
Right. Well, we took care of Iraq.
Yeah. So we have 2 new additions to the axis of evil, great job, Mitch McConnell, dusting off an old favorite. Okay, more from Mitch.
There's resistance among some Republicans, including here in the Senate.
about bundling things together. Is it possible to pass Ukraine aid if it's not tied to Israel?
I just think that's a mistake. I mean, I know there are some Republicans in the Senate and maybe more in the House that think Ukraine is somehow different. I view it as all interconnected.
Interconnected. I like that.
All interconnected.
He sounds like almost like an intersectional.
Absolutely. That's a great example of intersectional imperialism. It's all interconnected.
Intersectionality,
He's right. He's right. So many people have tried to pretend that somehow fighting a proxy war in Ukraine is somehow a progressive position. When meanwhile the Biden administration was blocking all diplomatic alternatives and arming a government that is dominated by ultra-nationalists. And in that respect, there is a parallel between Ukraine and Israel.
Right.
In both cases, the U.S. is arming a proxy state